On release, and even still today, Fallout 76 had some issues. I don't really think that's a secret to anyone, but at the same time, there are a few things done really well in this game that stood out to me, probably stood out to you, and in this video, we're going to be taking a look at one of them, the new creatures added into Fallout 76. And in this video, we're going to be taking a look at each of those new creatures. I would wager most of you watching this video will learn something. Even if you play the game quite extensively, actually getting an up and close look at these creatures is rare, but either way, starting it off, let's actually first look at some of the humanoids in this game. The first of which is the mole miner. This is one of my favorite new enemy types to get added in, and it actually has a pretty interesting backstory. As you find these guys in game, it'll pretty much be at a mine, of which there are a variety of all around Fallout 76. Unfortunately, even though they are one of the most interesting new enemies in my eyes, we don't get a detailed backstory as to what happened to them, but in West Virginia there are a lot of mines, there's a big coal mining community there, and after the bombs dropped, all of the workers in those mines actually fused with their mine suits, and that ended up producing the mole miners. As you interact with them, you could hear their grumbles, making it seem like their speech was lost in the process, although it is interesting that they do have some degree of intelligence. They could use weapons, and it seems like they're talking even if it's not totally legible. And oftentimes you could find these mole miners around mole rats and they don't actually fight each other, so there could be some kind of connection there also. Outside of mole miners, the other new human-based creature you can encounter are of course the Scorched. You find these pretty much all across the map, and in that you actually can see more basic versions, but also some customized versions dependent on their location. And the Scorched actually have a pretty interesting backstory that some of you guys might not be familiar with. This will be minor spoilers for Fallout 4 story. The Scorched were originally humans that were transformed due to exposure to the Scorched Plague. This plague was created before the Great War began, but then used and advanced after the Great War. The first use of the Scorched Plague was actually on bats. Those bats later turned into the Scorched beasts we do see everywhere. In effect, these were in some of their underground tunnels, like how you see bats all underground. In the lower Fallout 76, there are a ton of Scorched beasts underground, but as it becomes overcrowded, one of them breaks free and comes out to the surface. Those are the fissure sites in the Scorched beasts you see around them. This also to some degree explains the Scorched beast behavior, why they're always flying around their fissure site. In effect, the rest of their friends are all down there still, so it makes a lot of sense they're going to hang out there and not just start venturing around everywhere. Further, the Scorched beasts themselves actually spread the Scorched Plague to other creatures, and naturally this plague isn't exclusive to humans. Thus, as you play through Fallout 76, even as you encounter a lot of new creatures, you'll also encounter Scorched versions of them. These are seemingly just regular creatures that were exposed to the plague and eventually transitioned, going onto the side of the Scorched. One thing particularly interesting about the Scorched themselves, they actually do have some level of intelligence. You can see them using weapons, you can see them actually talking, suggesting they're controlled by some kind of hive mind, and this is all apparently controlled by the Scorched Beast Queen. While playing through the game, you've probably seen the Scorched kind of strike a pose. It almost looks like they're trying to blend in and look like one of those petrified corpses. In reality, this is actually just a byproduct of their physiology. The petrified corpses you see everywhere are actually old Scorched. Over time, if they're not actively being controlled by the hive mind, or if there's just not a lot of activity in a certain area, they will take one of those still positions and as they kind of just stand there, from the inside out start petrifying, and eventually all of them would turn into petrified corpses. This could be one potential explanation as to what happens to the Scorched. The reason we see them in none of the other Fallout games that take place at a later time. But yeah, if you were curious as to where the Scorched came from, it's kind of the Scorched Beast. But speaking of the Scorched Beast, as I mentioned, these were originally bats in underground caverns, then they were exposed to the original Scorched Plague and then kind of turned into the Scorched Beasts as you see them now. So those were some of the big ones, the heavy hitters of where the humans ended up going. But there's actually a whole myriad of otherwise minor or almost neutral creatures you can also encounter, a lot of these being pretty cool that you probably totally missed. For the vast majority of these, there's no real lore or backstory, just hey, this animal was in the wild, the bombs dropped, and radiation transformed it. You can find things like beavers that are quite mutated and their tails actually look pretty gnarly in this form. There's not really a ton going on with these guys. They are pretty cute, and after pacifying them, it makes me really wish there were pets in this game. Similar to beavers, we also do have things like opossums, and after getting to look more closely at this one, I had a whole newfound respect for Bethesda's modeling department. They look terrifying, and 95% of the time I just ignore them in game. there are foxes, which, although cool, are kind of boring. It's just like a worse version of a dog that you can't have as a companion. Although this one in particular, before filming this video, I had no idea foxes were in Fallout 76. Squirrels are pretty similar to all the rest on this list, although squirrels are particularly frightening. As you can see, when you look up close, they look just kind of gnarly to begin with, but these guys actually also have a lot more sound effects than all the other creatures I've been showing you in this category. And if there's one I could take home as a pet or keep in my camp in a little cage, it would definitely be the squirrel. I like these ones the most. Outside of that, one of the other notable standouts is actually this frog. These things look pretty cool. They definitely have some good sound effect work on them, but even further, they definitely have some kind of electric effect going on around their heads. I tried to look through the lore for an explanation of this, and I couldn't really find one. They actually do drop uranium, so that could tie into it somehow, but it certainly seems like these frogs are energized to some degree. It also is pretty interesting how frogs got this treatment, but toads got this one, and also the firefly. These things are actually pretty cool, and I've only seen them once or twice in game. I'm sure a lot more I just missed them as they flew by. Unlike pretty much every other bug, this one won't try to kill you, it'll just fly away if you attack it. But even further, it does have a genuine glow effect. It will glow and light up other things around it, especially at nighttime. Something interesting though, it seems like there are big fireflies and small fireflies. Looking around the Maya region in particular, you can actually see fireflies. They almost look identical, they're just way smaller and non-interactable compared to their larger counterparts. Two other minor creatures that are returning but actually got name changes, which is interesting. The Rad Rabbit is now simply the Rabbit. This is originally introduced in Far Harbor, and as far as I could tell, it's identical in-game as it was in Far Harbor. But it still is a pretty cool one, and hey, it got a name change for some reason. But then also the Rad Rat. Previously, it had a dash in between, but now the dash is gone, and the Rad Rat is one concurrent word. Pretty much all these creatures are labeled as enemies, but if you get close to them, they will just run away. And you'll be able to find almost all of these guys at this one little shack. So if you actually want to explore or discover some in game for yourself, this is where you could do that. But shifting away from those, another pretty interesting enemy we can find is the Mega Sloth, which if you haven't liked the video already, now could be a great time to do so. Finding the Mega Sloth was quite frustrating for me. The first time I had an immediate crash to desktop. The second time, it just died. Yeah, no, I don't really know what happened there. But then finally, I could bring you some close-ups, and this guy definitely is interesting. He has a lot going on around him. The lore of this is just, hey, there were some sloths, and they got mutated by radiation. On his back, you could actually see a bunch of mushrooms. In real life, sloths actually allow fungi to grow in their furs, so this seems to be an exaggeration of that. Even further, close-up, you could actually see just how large his hand and foot claws are. Those are pretty massive and daunting claws, which speaking of, hey, wouldn't it be really cool to get a Mega Sloth claw weapon? That's definitely a welcome addition in my book. Outside of that though, in game he does have several different attacks, taking advantage of his mushrooms to create a little plume. He could like throw some dirt at you or something like that. And then also just the more typical melee attacks that you're used to seeing. But then moving on, we also do have rad toads. These guys are pretty interesting. It's another case of just, yep, a toad mutated and got really big. They do have a ton of eyes all over their head, which just makes them look extra freaky, especially when they blink. Even further, as it does attack you, it can just do a melee attack or that tongue attack that you're probably used to seeing, and also looks pretty cool. It seems like his tongue splits in 3 ways at the end. Although one component you might have not known about, on his back he has several eggs. He can actually drop these eggs down as a mine, so then if you later step on them, it will explode and deal damage to you. So if you're ever fighting rad toads and you feel like mines are just coming out of nowhere, it's their eggs being dropped. Fallout 76 also added in mutated ticks. These guys are pretty interesting. They do have a sort of jumping attack, they'll kind of lunge at you, but as you first see them, they actually will have an empty blood pack. While attacking you, they will fill this up and actually gain a new ability with a kind of shooting blood at you and it deals damage for some reason attack. Outside of that, looking at their head, it almost looks like they were built to ram things, and that's kind of what they do, just ram into you, sometimes biting. The honey beast is actually a pretty interesting enemy type. The honey beast itself is just one large and mutated honeybee. The interesting part being, of course, we also do have bee swarms that come out of it. Those are seemingly made up of the same thing, they just didn't mutate to the same degree or in the same way. There's no lore explanation for this difference, but it seems like it's basically just one big bee, but then on its back is a hive that is built out. If you actually get close to the honeybees, you can hear a buzzing that's from all the bees that are located inside of it. It's not really clear if that beehive is part of the mutation process and actually integrated into it, or just kind of a beehive that was built right on top of him. He also does have a variety of attacks. You can see he's too big to fly now, but sometimes he'll lunge at you and flap his wings to kind of get a jump start. As I mentioned before, he also does have bees that will fly out of him and try and attack you. Bees are not unique to honeybees. Throughout Fallout 76's world, you also can just stumble upon beehives and collect honey from them. And it seems like each time you take the honey out, a bee swarm will actually fly out to attack you. Nice detail, Bethesda. But now getting to some of the more interesting things, we do have the cryptids. Presently in Fallout 76, there are 6 cryptids: the Flatwoods monster, Grafton monster, Mothman, Snallygaster, Wendigo, and Sheepsquatch. And something pretty interesting we'll see with this is, even though all of these have real-world counterparts and real-life lore around them, in the Fallout universe, some of these have that same explanation, while other ones actually do have an alternate one: scientific experimentation or the radiation from the bombs. Take, for example, the Snallygaster. This was actually one of the creatures that was a man-made creation. At West Tech Research, they were doing all kinds of experiments with the FEV virus. This is the same thing that explains the super mutants being here, and it is what created the super mutants. Along the way, they were doing other trials with other modifications to the FEV virus, and one such one produced the Snallygaster. They were experimenting with what happens when you actually combine traits from separate species. And that's why the Snallygaster has such an interesting combo. It has several sets of legs, arms, or feet, whatever you want to call them. In game, I would actually say this is one of the coolest looking cryptids. You can see all of its eyes blink at once, and even though we saw other creatures do that, I feel like with this one, it's just particularly scary and weird. It can fire acid at you. It does have an acidically laced tongue, which can be seen shooting out for a short range attack, and it kind of looks like a naked mole rat, so that's cool. From the success of the Snallygasters in the FEV experiments, they later went on to actually create the Grafton monster. This was another FEV experiment done at the West Tech Research Facility. It was done after the Snallygaster one. And in fact, the strain used to create the Grafton monster is actually a derivative of the Snallygaster strain. In-game, this one's probably the most common of the cryptids. You can find it in fixed locations and at fairly low levels, making it very approachable. It is extremely large and doesn't actually have a head, one arm being slightly bigger than the other, but otherwise most of his attacks are just hitting you. He does have one ranged ability, which is pretty interesting. I'm not sure I even knew that was a thing before filming this. And this is another one that I feel like could be really cool to have a unique weapon associated with. I just feel like you could do something with the hand region of this guy. But then moving on to the other of the common cryptids, we do have the Wendigo. These guys are actually a little bit different. Even though there were reportings of Wendigos before the bombs did drop, even in-game and in the in-game lore, the explanation we get in-game is that it's actually from the radiation of the Great War. So I'm not really sure what people are seeing beforehand, but it almost certainly wasn't exactly the same as this one. Wendigos were actually byproducts of a cannibal raider gang taking shelter in the Wendigo cave and then getting exposed to radiation to form all of the Wendigos you do see. So their cannibal nature seemingly is a byproduct of the humans that originated them, not actually the mutation. As you see them in game, they're probably one of the most terrifying of the cryptids. They let out this hurling scream as you initially encounter them. It's pretty clear they were humans at one point. You could actually see some of their hair flowing around, but they also are very lengthy and very quick, walking now on all fours rather than the bipedal nature that they had previously. They primarily are going to lunge and just melee you. They do have a small area of effect ability that will disorient you and do minor damage, but then we do have the Flatwoods monster, and this one is also pretty interesting. The Flatwoods monster originally appeared before the Great War. People reported sightings of it all around and throughout Flatwoods, and for the most part, very little is known about what it is or where it comes from. As you see it in game, it's very elusive. Even though it is aggro to you, oftentimes the first time you see it, it will teleport away or quickly disappear, cloaking itself. Following this, it may come back for a repeat attack and actually use its lasers on you. Over the months since Fallout 76 has been out, by killing the Flatwoods monster, it seems like you'd actually see it literally just is a little alien inside of a larger suit, but it still does raise several questions. Is this alien associated with all of the other aliens in the Fallout franchise? In Fallout 76, you could find several other locations that make it seem like there was some experimentation or research being done on aliens. Could the Flatwoods monster be connected to that, trying to save his alien friends or something else? But largely with this one, what you see is what you get. Everything we know about this is just by looking at it and trying to dissect it after it's been killed. I would say it's pretty likely we'll get a quest line in the future that gives us further context or more explanations around this. Then we also do have the Mothman. This was a creature reported being seen before the Great War, as you can see by the statues to him. Under that statue, you could also find a bunch of Mothman eggs. In the Fallout 76 lore, you could find a lot of people heralding the Mothman as some kind of wise creature that can enlighten you, and apparently visited people to enlighten them. This led to the forming of Mothman cults that you can find scattered around Appalachia. As the cult suspected that the Great War was going to begin, they actually tried to summon the Mothman, asking him for wisdom, and he provided it. One of the cult's members was reportedly given knowledge that a great flood would be coming the next day and they would have to get onto the rooftops. The next day, the bombs did eventually drop, only strengthening the cult's power and people's interest in it. But then they all turned into scorched. In-game, the Mothman's actually a very interesting creature. There's a quest you can do to actually summon a wise Mothman. Even further, his varying eye colors actually indicate something to you. If it's purple, he is passive, yellow, he is cautioned, and red, he is attacking you. In combat, he typically uses his sonic attack, but he could fly up, disappear, and land somewhere else to confuse you, and he seems to have some kind of mystical ability, as when you eventually do kill him, he may just disappear. The Mothman is particularly interesting because it's not entirely clear what's going on with this one. Even though all of the other creatures have pretty plausible explanations of radiation, human experimentation, or aliens, Mothman is the one standout. It seemingly appeared before the Great War began if you take the cult at their word, meaning that it likely isn't just a byproduct of radiation. But even further, you have the question of whether or not the radiation changed it or affected it in some way. You just have to imagine at some point we're getting a Cult of the Mothman questline, or at least I hope we are. And then last but not least, we do have the creature that isn't presently activated in the game, even though he technically is in the game, that being Sheepsquatch. As of right now, we don't know a ton about him, and even once his quest comes out, we still might not know a ton about him. We don't know if it was actually a genuine cryptid like Mothman and just appearing naturally in the world, or a byproduct of experimentation. And even further, if there's any effect from the Great War and the bombs dropping. Did it mutate the Sheepsquatch? Was it a real cryptid that only got stronger by that added radiation? Based on the images, it certainly looks like something went on. It definitely looks like a mutated creature. We know he's going to have several different abilities, being able to shoot quills at you, a melee attack, a kicking attack, and even a poison spray attack that apparently is his P. But at least as it stands right now, the Sheepsquatch is a very real creature. It will eventually, I think, get added to the game, so it definitely deserves a spot on this list. But either way, yeah, those are all of the new creatures in Fallout 76 that Bethesda brought to the table, and some of the lore or backstory around them. Hopefully you guys found this one interesting. I personally did. There were several creatures on this that I genuinely didn't know were in the game, or even further, didn't know a piece of lore about them. It's pretty interesting how even among all of these cryptids, many of them have pretty normal explanations, whether it be test subjects, aliens, or a ton of radiation. It also is interesting how we still don't have answers for some of them. What actually is the Flatwoods monster? What exactly is Mothman, and what kind of powers does he have? All in all though, that's going to wrap it up for this one. As always, again, I thank you for watching. Hopefully you found this video informative, but with that, I hope to see you all next time. Later.